The Battle of Coral Balmoral was a series of actions fought during the Vietnam War between the 1st Australian Task Force and the North Vietnamese 7th Division and Viet Cong, 40 kilometres northeast of Saigon, following the defeat of the Communist Tet Offensive in January and February. In late April, 2 Australian infantry battalions, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, with supporting arms, were again deployed from their base at Nui Dat in Phoc Tui Province to positions astride infiltration routes leading to Saigon to interdict renewed movement against the capital. Part of the wider Allied Operation Ton Thang Gai, it was launched in response to intelligence reports of another impending Communist offensive, yet the Australians experienced little fighting during this period. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong successfully penetrated the capital on the 5th of May, plunging Saigon into chaos during the May offensive in an attempt to influence the upcoming Paris peace talks scheduled to begin on the 13th. During 3 days of intense fighting, the attacks were repelled by US and South Vietnamese forces, and although another attack was launched by the Viet Cong several days later, the offensive was again defeated with significant losses on both sides, causing extensive damage to Saigon and many civilian casualties. By the 12th of May the fighting was over, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were forced to withdraw, having suffered heavy casualties. U.S. casualties were also heavy, and it proved to be their most costly week of the war. 1 ATF was redeployed on the 12th of May to obstruct the withdrawal of forces from the capital, with 2 battalions establishing a fire support base named FSB Coral, just east of Lai Khe in Binh Duong Province, in an area of operations known as Ao Surfers. However, poor reconnaissance and inadequate operational planning led to delays and confusion during the fly-in, and the Australians had only partially completed FSB Coral by the evening. The North Vietnamese mounted a number of battalion-sized assaults on the night of 12-13 May, with a heavy bombardment from 3:30 signalling the start, exploiting the disorganized defense to penetrate the Australian perimeter. The North Vietnamese 141st Regiment temporarily captured a forward gun position during close-quarters fighting, before being repulsed by superior firepower the following morning. Casualties were heavy on both sides, and although the Australians had won a convincing victory, they had come close to suffering both a political and military defeat at the hands of the North Vietnamese. The following day 1 RA was deployed to defend FSB Coral, while 3 RA established FSB Koji to the west to ambush staging areas and infiltration routes. Coral was again assaulted in the early hours of the 16th of May, coming under a heavy barrage followed by another regimental-sized attack. Again the base was penetrated, but after a 6-hour battle the North Vietnamese were forced to withdraw after suffering heavy losses. Expecting further fighting, the Australians were subsequently reinforced with Centurion tanks and additional artillery. On the 22nd of May, FSB Coral was again attacked overnight, coming under a short but accurate mortar bombardment which was broken up by Australian artillery and mortars. The Australians then moved against the Communist base areas east of Route 16, with 3 RA redeploying to establish FSB Balmoral on the 24th of May, 4.5 kilometres to the north, now supported by tanks which had arrived from Coral just hours before. The infantry at Balmoral were subjected to a 2-battalion attack by the North Vietnamese 165th Regiment, following a rocket and mortar barrage at 3:45 on the 26th of May. The attack fell primarily on D Company before being repelled with heavy casualties by the combined firepower of the tanks and infantry. The next day the Australians at Coral assaulted a number of bunkers that had been located just outside the base, with a troop of Centurions supported by infantry destroying the bunkers and their occupants without loss. A second major North Vietnamese attack, again of regimental strength, was made against Balmoral at 2:30 on 28 May but was called off after 30 minutes after being soundly defeated by the supporting fire of the tanks, artillery and mortars. Regardless, the battle continued into June as the Australians patrolled their area of operations. However, with contacts decreasing, 1 ATF returned to Nui Dat on 6 June, being relieved by US and South Vietnamese forces. The battle was the first time the Australians had clashed with regular North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong main force units operating in battalion and regimental strength in conventional warfare. During 26 days of fighting, the Communists sustained heavy losses and were forced to postpone a further attack on Saigon, while 1 ATF also suffered significant casualties, the largest unit-level action of the war for the Australians. Today the battle is considered one of the most famous actions fought by the Australian Army during the Vietnam War. Background: military situation based in Nui Dat in Phoc Tui Province. The 1st Australian Task Force was a part of US 2 Field Force, Vietnam, under the overall command of Lieutenant General Frederick Wayand. By early 1968, 1 ATF had been reinforced and was at full strength with 3 infantry battalions supported by armor, artillery, aviation and engineers, while logistic arrangements were provided by the 1st Australian Logistic Support Group based at the port of Ung Tau. Commanded by Brigadier Ron Hughes, 1 ATF had continued to operate independently within Phoc Tui. And while the war had become a series of large-scale search and destroy operations in a war of attrition for the Americans, the Australians had largely pursued their own counter-insurgency campaign despite the differences between Australian and American methods at times, producing friction between the Allies. Regardless, 1 ATF was also available for deployment elsewhere in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, and with the province coming progressively under control throughout 1967, the Australians would increasingly spend a significant period of time conducting operations further afield. The Tet Offensive began on 31 January 1968. With 85,000 to 100,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops simultaneously assaulting population centers and Allied installations across South Vietnam in an attempt to incite a general uprising against the South Vietnamese government and its American supporters. In response, 1 ATF was deployed along likely infiltration routes in order to defend the vital Bien Ho along Bin complex near Saigon between January and March. As part of Operation Coburg, heavy fighting resulted in 17 Australians killed and 61 wounded, while Communist casualties included at least 145 killed, 110 wounded and 5 captured, with many more removed from the battlefield. Meanwhile, the remaining Australian forces in Phoc Tui were stretched thin, with elements of 3 RA successfully repelling an assault on Ba Ria and later spoiling a harassing attack on Long Dinh and conducting a sweep of Hoa Long, killing 50 Viet Cong and wounding 25 for the loss of 5 killed and 24 wounded. At the strategic level, the general uprising never eventuated, and in late February the Communist offensive collapsed after suffering more than 45,000 killed, against South Vietnamese and Allied losses of 6,000 men. Regardless, it proved to be a turning point in the war, and although it had been a tactical disaster for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, Hanoi emerged with a significant political victory as confidence in the American military and political leadership collapsed, as did public support for the war in the United States. Prior to Tet, American commanders and politicians had talked confidently about winning the war, arguing that General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition had reached the point where the Communists were losing soldiers and equipment faster than they could be replaced. Yet the scale of the offensive, and the surprise and violence with which it had been launched, had shocked the American public and contradicted such predictions of imminent victory. In its wake, President Lyndon Johnson announced that he would no longer seek a second term in office. Tet had a similar effect on Australian public opinion, and caused growing uncertainty in the government about the determination of the United States to remain militarily involved in Southeast Asia. Amid the initial shock, Prime Minister John Gorton unexpectedly declared that Australia would not increase its military commitment in Vietnam beyond the current level of 8,000 personnel. On the ground, the war continued without respite, and Hughes, the 180th commander, turned his attention to D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, deciding to strike at its base areas in the Min Dam secret zone located in the long high hills south of Long Dinh and Dat Du, 14 kilometres from Nui Dat. The 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had suffered heavy casualties in February 1967 while operating in the Long Highs, which were heavily defended by mines and booby traps, despite previous operations by the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade in June 1966 and two smaller South Vietnamese operations. The area had remained a Viet Cong safe haven. However, this time the Australians would use two battalions supported by tanks and airstrikes in an attempt to reduce the base area. Operation Pinaroo began on the 27th of February, with 2 RA and 3 RA cordoning off the complex, with the rifle companies patrolling and ambushing at night in order to prevent the Viet Cong from escaping. On the 8th of March, the Australians conducted a wide encircling movement to tighten the cordon, while a sustained bombardment by US B-52 heavy bombers and artillery targeted the hill the next day. A combined force of infantry from 3 RA supported by armor then advanced on the foothills, before clearing the minefields and destroying an extensive base area which included a deep cave system that had first been used by the Viet Minh against the French in the 1950s. Each Australian rifle company then methodically searched its area of operations, while engineers destroyed the underground facilities, a task which required the use of tons of explosives. The operation lasted until the 15th of April, with mines, including many M16s that had been lifted by the Viet Cong from the controversial barrier minefield laid by the Australians at Dat Du, once again claiming a significant toll. 10 Australians were killed and another 36 were wounded, while known Viet Cong casualties included 21 killed, 14 wounded and 40 captured. 57 camps and bunker systems were also destroyed, as were large quantities of weapons, munitions and supplies, judged a success by the Australians despite their heavy losses. The operation had resulted in significant disruption to the Viet Cong and hindered their operations for some time. Regardless, with 180th lacking the manpower to hold the area, the failure of South Vietnamese forces to permanently occupy the Long Highs meant that any gains were only fleeting, and the D-445 Battalion headquarters soon returned to the area after ejecting a South Vietnamese regional force company a few months later. Meanwhile, 7 RA had finished its last operation in March and was relieved by 1 RA on the 9th of April, returning to Australia having completed its 12-month tour.